Dobry wieczór Państwu, dobry wieczór.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're broadcasting from far, but we are with our hearts with you, Leszek, and your team. Congratulations. I'm Katarzyna de Lazari-Radek. I am a philosopher. I work for the Łódź University, and as Leszek mentioned yesterday, Łódź is my hometown, although I like going to different places and working in different places. Łódź is my hometown. Today, I have the honor to speak to Peter Singer, my teacher, my tutor, a person who changed the lives of millions of humans and non-humans, namely those which we call animals simply. Peter Singer is the professor at Princeton University. He has been working here for over 20 years. He is the author of dozens of books, which are hard to enumerate, but I'm sure that at least some of you are familiar with them. We can say that Peter Singer is the most important contemporary ethicist, one of the most important contemporary philosophers. The most, it's always hard to define, but in philosophy, we can make it. Philosophy is to encourage thinking, is to encourage asking the same questions, and Peter Singer is a master of this trade. He has been frustrating and unnerving us for so many years with his questions and statements. Let's imagine he comes to us, looks into the wardrobe and says, you should tidy up. So he throws everything onto the floor and says, now take every single piece and put it on the shelf once again. That's what he did in the practical ethics. He is 75 years old and not slowing down. He has been working continuously on different books and carries out a number of projects with people worldwide. He is famous for dealing with three areas. I have to use some prompts. The first book was published in 1972 when he wrote Famine, Affluence, and Morality. This is an essay in a book form. He encourages us to verify our mindset on the obligations towards other people. He says, if you go somewhere and notice a child in need, or a child in a pond, as he wrote it, so a child which is sinking in a pond, we look around and see nobody. What do? We wear expensive trousers, expensive shoes, try to consider whether it's really worth it. No. We don't reconsider it. When I tell this story to my students, they look at me as if I was insane, because this is an obvious case. You immediately run to help the child, regardless of what shoes you wear and whether you have to buy a new pair. Peter Singer uses this example to say that if you accept and if you admit that you have the obligation, the duty to help the child in the pond, you have the obligation to help children and adults in needs somewhere else. It means that if you can afford coffee, or water, or cinema ticket, you can also afford sending money somewhere and save lives in Africa, Asia, and in other places where it is needed. 40 years after the referenced essay, Peter wrote The Life You Can Save, where he says it's not enough to help. You have to help effectively. There is the whole concept of effective altruism. This is one area. The other area, 1975, animal liberation, perhaps the most well-known book by Peter, the book which you might well know. He is the founder of the animal defense movement. We're going to talk about it with him. And the third area of practical ethics, this is the new edition, the first one, 1979, Practical Ethics. The book became the manual in the Anglo-Saxon world for practical ethics. Peter Singer asks the most difficult question, namely, what's wrong about killing? What's wrong about killing the animals? What's wrong about killing unborn babies? Can we accept euthanasia? And finally, whether we should have the right to decide about the life and death of disabled children. The latest news on Monday, Peter was awarded for his accomplishments. This is an excellent summary of his work. And now I'm going to switch to English.
See you. Thank you for accepting the invitation, and great congratulations on your getting Bergeron Prize.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to speak to you, and of course, I'm very happy with the recognition that the prize has given me.
So tell us, what are you going to do with your 1 million prize?
So I don't really need that money for myself. I am comfortably off, and my family are sufficiently comfortably well off. So I'm going to give it to the most effective charities that I can find. I'm going to give half of it to The Life You Can Save, which is a charity that I founded some years ago, though I don't sort of run it. I'm not hands-on with it, but it recommends the most effective charities helping people in extreme poverty. And I think that's really important, because the most effective charities helping people in extreme poverty do much more with each dollar that they receive than the less effective charities. So that's why I'm trying to promote more effective giving. So that will be what I do with half of the $1 million. I'm also going to give a substantial part, more than a third of it, to charities trying to reduce the suffering of animals, because I've been concerned pretty much all of my life with animal suffering. I think it's a very neglected area. We inflict an immense amount of suffering on animals, particularly on animals in factory farms, which is the vast majority of the animals that we humans control and dictate what their lives are like. So those organizations, the most effective ones, again, of course, will receive a large part of the prize monies. But I'm reserving a part of it, a tenth or maybe a bit more, for organizations and causes that the public votes for. I'm setting up an opportunity for people to go to the website of The Life You Can Save, at thelifeyoucansave.org, and download my book, The Life You Can Save, which they can do absolutely free as an ebook or an audiobook. And after doing that, and perhaps thinking about these issues, to vote for different organizations who could receive the last portion of the money. So I would like the public to be involved in some way in this decision.
Wonderful. And I hope that others will take part in your challenge and help you to decide whom else to give. So first, talking about animals, how did it happen that you become interested in animal issue?
Well, this was really, in a way, almost accidental. It seems strange that something that has become so central in my life could happen as a result of an accident. But I was a graduate student at Oxford in 1970. So, it's perhaps hard for people nowadays to think back that far and to know that in 1970, I was 24 years old. I could have done a whole undergraduate degree and started a graduate course without really having been prompted to think about the ethics of what I was eating. That is, basically, I was a meat eater, grown up in Australia. Everybody eats meat. It was cheap, plentiful. And I never really thought seriously about the ethical questions it involves because I hadn't met other vegetarians. There were very, very few vegetarians around. But I happened to have lunch with a Canadian philosophy graduate student called Richard Keshen. And I noticed that when he was choosing his lunch, he asked whether there was any meat in the sauce on the spaghetti. And when he was told that there was, he took a salad plate instead. So I wondered about that, and I asked him, what's his problem with meat? And he said something very simple, that is that he didn't think it was right to treat animals the way that the animals that we eat were being treated. And, I didn't really know exactly what he meant because I thought that all of these animals were outdoors living quite good lives. Of course, I knew that they got trucked to slaughter in the end and got killed. But he told me, no, their lives aren't good at all. Increasingly, they've been confined indoors. The only real consideration is the profitability of the enterprise. In other words, how much meat or eggs or milk we can get out of these animals and how cheaply, how little labor we have to pay for and so on. And the welfare of the animals wasn't really considered. And I investigated that a bit myself. He recommended a book called Animal Machines by Ruth Harrison, which was the only book written about factory farming at that time, and it hadn't had any big sales. But it was very convincing, I found, and it seemed that he was right. So after that, I thought, well, if I want to study moral philosophy and ethics, I've got to do something about this. I can't just go on eating unethically every day of my life, supporting an industry that is inflicting immense suffering on animals when it's all completely unnecessary. We don't need to eat animals. So that's how I started taking up the issue of the ethics of how we should treat animals. And eventually, after a few years, took sort of 5 years before it was published, I wrote Animal Liberation to try and make more people aware of what now struck me as a very important but very neglected ethical question.
So I know that you are just revising Animal Liberation right now. Can you tell us what has changed? What has changed for better? And have any things changed for the worst?
Well, let's look at the positives first. Some things have definitely changed for the better. In Europe, for example, I think has been one place where several things have changed for the better. In particular, in my first edition of Animal Liberation, I described some of the worst forms of the confinement of farm animals, and we're talking here about hundreds of millions of animals. For example, laying hens who provide eggs were kept in cages, very small cages, like 4 hens crammed into a cage about that big, where they can't even stretch their wings. In fact, even if you only had 1 hen in those small cages, they wouldn't have been able to stretch their wings. and veal calves were kept in narrow stalls, so narrow they couldn't even turn around, couldn't really walk more than a single step forwards or backwards. And also the breeding sows, the mother pigs from which the other pigs were produced, were similarly confined in very small stalls. Now, the European Union has banned all those three methods of confinement. The hens are still in cages, but they are bigger cages. And I was pleased to see just last month that the European Union Commission is drafting regulations to ban cages altogether, which will be a further step forward. So that's a good example of progress. And it's not only in the European Union, in California and some other states of the United States. Similarly, some of those methods of confining animals have been banned. The testing of cosmetics on animals has been banned in a number of countries, again in the European Union. Also, just 2 days ago, Mexico banned it and joined a number of other countries. So, yes, there is some progress. And I should add, there's progress in the awareness of the issue of how we should treat animals. That's no longer so neglected. And of course, for those who want to stop eating animals or eating any animal products and going completely vegan, the availability of plant-based vegan products has greatly increased, and they're in supermarkets everywhere. So that's the positives, the good news. The bad news is that there are actually far more animals in factory farms than there were before. And that's particularly because as countries like China and some of its East Asian neighbors have become more prosperous, people have use their extra money to buy more meat. That was seen as a good thing to do, as a thing that you do when you get a bit of extra money, you buy more meat. So to provide that extra meat and also other animal products, eggs and milk, the Chinese in particular have vastly expanded factory farming. And so there are far more animals now confined in factory farming, and the Chinese do not have welfare laws to prevent the producers treating animals in ways that are really give them very miserable lives. So that's, I think, the biggest negative that has occurred since I wrote Animal Liberation.
So what can be done? What's the future for factory farming or against factory farming? Have you ever tried the cultured meat?
So cultured meat is something that is only just coming on the market, and let me explain to those who may not know what this refers to. We're talking about taking an animal cell, maybe just a single cell from an animal, and growing it in a nutrient solution so that it multiplies. And what we are producing then is meat, real meat of that particular species of animal, but there is no living, sentient, breathing organism. It should be much more efficient. There should be much less waste. We don't have to produce bones and other internal organs that people may not eat. There will be far fewer greenhouse gas emissions coming from it. And it should eventually be cheaper. This is only just starting to come on the market now. Singapore was the first country to license the sale for humans of this cultured meat. It did so with a form of chicken that is sold in restaurants or particular restaurants in Singapore. It's still more expensive than ordinary chicken. And other countries are also starting to produce this. So I haven't tasted it yet myself, but I think it will be on the way, and I hope that it will replace a lot of meat products in 10 or 20 years. So I haven't tasted that. What I have tasted is the plant-based meat that is now being produced that has the taste and the sort of chewiness, if you like, of meat. So I recently tasted what's called an Impossible Burger, which is one of these products produced in the United States and I think available in some other countries. It's a long time since I've eaten a real meat burger, so I can't compare it with one. But people who do eat meat burgers say that it is actually better than some of the burgers and as good as the top of the range kind of burgers anyway. So I hope that that may also replace a lot of meat production, because that's also a more humane and more ethical way of producing food for those who want to eat those kinds of burgers that look and taste and chew like burgers made from cows.
So a big part of your animal liberation book is on research on animals. What changes can we see here?
Well, I must admit, when I set out doing this research on the revised edition, I was hoping that it would be very difficult to find really bad experiments. You know, in the earlier editions, it unfortunately wasn't difficult at all. There were a lot of really pointless and very painful experiments that I could document in those editions. But I had heard from friends and people working in the science area that the regulations now in most of the world, in the United States, North America generally, Australia, the European Union, were much stricter, and that those kinds of experiments that I had described in the earlier editions couldn't be done anymore. But to my great regret, I found that that is not really the case. It may be that the regulations are somewhat stricter. It may be that there are fewer of these really painful experiments, but they're certainly still being performed. For example, to take a country that is a member of the European Union, I found an experiment or a paper describing experiments by a team of researchers in Hungary and Croatia, researching on trying to produce an animal model of post-traumatic stress disease, which is known as PTSD. So these researchers were describing methods used to try to produce animal models that are in some way equivalent to the traumatic stress that humans may suffer from after an accident, after being in war, in terrible circumstances like that. So they started off by trying to stress the animals, using typically rats here. So sometimes they used multiple stresses. For example, they would put the rats in a small plastic tube so that they simply could not move. They were just completely immobilized in the tube, and they would leave them there for an hour or two, which obviously would be a very stressful experience. Another thing they did was called the forced swimming test. They would drop them in a cylinder of deep water so that the rats had to swim for maybe 20 minutes, otherwise they would drown, and there seemed to be no escape from that. And then they would pull them out before they drowned. They would also give them inescapable electric shock through their feet that they couldn't escape from. And these researchers actually say, well, this hasn't produced a good animal model of post-traumatic stress, but maybe maybe part of the problem is that there has to be an early childhood event which causes stress in humans, and only, which sets them up, if you like, which primes them for distress. And only after that they get this traumatic incident. So they were actually advocating that the young animals should be separated from their mothers for several hours a day, because we know that with mammals, it's stressful for babies to be separated from their mothers, of course. And then when they're reared as adults, only then should we do these things that I just described, like immobilizing them, forcing them to swim for a long time, or giving them electric shocks. So I was disappointed to find that this kind of experiment is still going on, and it hasn't really helped anybody with PTSD. It hasn't produced useful animal models. So it's a lot of suffering going on, not just in this particular team. I know it's going on in many other countries as well, without the kind of benefits that you might think could justify it if it was saving an immense amount of human suffering and distress, but it doesn't seem to be.
Still very hard to be positive about that. I was to ask you about the suffering of wild animals, but it seems that there are still so many things that we should do to improve the life of animals that we take care of. but still, I mean, the subject for philosophers is interesting, and some animal people working on animal rights do wonder whether the time will come that we will, when we need to take care of wild animals. And what do you think about that issue?
Well, I agree. This is an interesting and quite difficult philosophical issue. As you say, I don't really think it's a practical one, given that we're doing so many horrible things to so many animals. I think, and unnecessarily in the factory farms and to some extent in the laboratories as well. I do think that's what we should focus on. But if you're interested in the question, should we protect wild animals? Should we try to reduce their suffering? I would say if we could do so without disturbing the ecology itself in ways that reduce suffering of some animals, but don't distort the natural balance that we have, then that would be a good thing to do. But of course, that's very difficult. That's exactly the problem with a great deal of wild animal suffering, that we have predators who kill their prey in ways that are not really humane. But if we were to interfere with that and try to stop it, the predators would die. And if there weren't predators, they wouldn't control the population of their prey, the herbivores. It certainly happened. In fact, where I am in Princeton, it's a problem with the deer population because there are no wolves around Princeton, and there are no indigenous Americans who hunt deer either. And there used to be those two predators that kept the deer population in check. So now the deer population is not really checked, and they can overgraze the forests, and they may starve in winter. So it's not really a better situation for them. And it's very difficult to see how we can really reduce wild animal suffering, without causing these sorts of problems. There may be some individual situations where we can do that, but to do it on a large scale without upsetting natural ecological systems seems to me to be beyond our abilities, at least for the foreseeable future.
So now, how do you choose whom to help? Yes, so let's talk about the whole problem of effective altruism. There are animals, there are people under different circumstances. Yes, so for example, we have a long-term and short-term programs, calamities. What do you think would be the most effective way, and to which causes we should concentrate in order to help best, to help in the most effective way?
Well, as I indicated when you asked me how I'm distributing the money from the Berggruen Prize, I am focused when it comes to helping people, particularly on people in extreme poverty. And that's because I think we can do so much more for people in extreme poverty. According to the World Bank, there is something like 700 to 800 million people in the world living on less than $2 a day. So if you think about trying to help those people, just imagine, let's say that you've got $1,000 that you can spare, and you give it to a family that is living on, well, less than $1,000 a year, obviously, if it's $2 a day. You've given them opportunities that they never had before, because living on $2 a day or less, they could not afford, for example, to put a corrugated iron roof over their dwelling. That just costs too much. They can't spare that. And instead they have to use thatch, which will leak when it rains heavily. And in the long run isn't even cheaper, because you have to replace it every year, whereas a corrugated iron roof may last 10 or 20 years. So, you can help them to stay dry, keep their food supplies dry, and in the long run save money for $1,000. Now, if there was somebody in poverty by American standards, let's say, they would not be living on $2 a day. they would be, I think the poverty line for a family of four here is about $23,000 a year. So if you had $1,000 to spare, you couldn't really make a life-changing difference to them. That would be nice for them, but it's just a little bit extra. So that example suggests that, not necessarily that we should be giving money, though that could be a good thing to do, and some good organizations are trying to do that, but that we should be focusing on people in extreme poverty, whether it's providing them with bed nets so their children don't die from malaria, whether it's offering them free cataract operations so that when they're blind because they've got cataracts and can't afford to get them removed, they can see again. That's an enormous benefit. Whether it's providing them with healthcare information, which can save them and their children from becoming seriously ill or dying. Whether it's giving them some mentoring and training in how to start a small business and maybe a little bit of capital so they can start that business. There are many good and effective charities that have been shown by independent research to give outstanding value for money. And if people want to know more about that, if they go to thelifeyoucansave.org and click on best charities, they'll find a list of those charities that have been independently verified as being the most effective. So that's, I think, the best way to help people. If we have the resources to help people, let's use them as effectively as you can. And that's what effective altruism is all about.
That's all good, but effective altruism is also about something that we call long-termism. Yes, so there are among us philosophers and scientists who believe, well, we have all the reasons to think that we humans or then the future humans-like intelligent beings will still exist for hundreds of thousands or maybe millions of years. So we should concentrate on other causes that will allow those millions of years of our existence to happen. So that's about reducing existential risk, yes? Technology, meteors, nuclear war. How about those causes? Would you agree that we should put some substantial resources on that cause as well?
Well, I certainly accept that it is important that we survive, or if not exactly us, that intelligent, thoughtful life that can improve our conditions and develop new technologies so that we can have large populations of people who live rich and fulfilling lives, and that can go on for centuries, millennia, or as you say, perhaps even millions of years. I think there is great value in that, and I'm glad that there are people thinking about this issue and doing some research, preliminary research perhaps at this stage, into how we can reduce those risks of extinction. For example, I welcome the fact that there are people working on tracking asteroids that might collide with our planet, big enough to cause our extinction, and trying to track that. And I suppose if we did find there was such an asteroid heading for us, maybe we could build a rocket that would carry an explosive that would deflect it, because we'll only have to deflect it a little bit and it would miss us, and that would be a very good thing. So, I'm happy that people are working on that. Some people are working on artificial intelligence, and if we had really super intelligence, how would we make sure that it was aligned with good values, that it wasn't going to sort of take over and destroy us? I'm glad that people are working on that, but I also think that there are huge problems in seeing far into the future and knowing what is really going to make a difference. So, I believe, and many people in the field who know more than I do about this think that this kind of superintelligence, let's say, is still several decades away. It's not really about to happen. And as we get closer to being able to produce it, then I think we'll have a better idea of the alignment. So, I'm not saying people shouldn't work on it now, they should, but in terms of putting a large amount of resources into this or into some of the other more speculative existential risks that we don't really know exactly how to reduce those risks, what will reduce those risks. I would prefer to put my resources into the problems that we see existing now, try to make the world a better place, trying to spread ethical values as well by helping other people. And who knows, that attitude might help to reduce existential risks as well. But what we do know is that it will certainly do a lot of good for people in extreme poverty here and now.
So we talked about animal issues and we talked about effective altruism and now a bit about bioethics in the 21st century. Maybe the biggest problem that we are facing now is the pandemic, the COVID pandemic. Do you think that bioethics should put any special concern over this pandemic and the future ones? Do you think that that can be one of the existential risks as well?
Well, a pandemic could be an existential risk. I don't think the present COVID-19 pandemic is an existential risk, but I suppose there could be variants that become much more lethal than the one at present. I'm somewhat more concerned about completely different viruses arising from pandemics. And this takes us back to factory farms, which I talked about earlier, because if you put tens of thousands of animals in a single building, crowd them together under stress, their immune system is going to be weakened, and it will be very easy for viruses to spread through them. And because there are so many animals, these viruses can mutate and reach more dangerous forms. And of course, humans do interact with these animals, at least before they're ready for slaughter. They will round them up and put them in trucks and take them to slaughter. So humans can then easily pick up these viruses, and we can have pandemics like that. We already had one in 2009. It was called the swine flu pandemic. It fortunately wasn't terribly lethal, but we could get pandemics that are extremely contagious and very lethal, and I think we should try to reduce that risk. So that's why I think there is an ethical and a further ethical imperative to reduce factory farming. But I think the pandemic has raised other bioethical issues as well, including issues about the allocation of resources, who gets to go on a respirator if there aren't enough respirators or there aren't enough intensive care units for everybody who needs them, which has certainly happened in some of the hotspots of the pandemic. So that's, for example, one important issue. Questions about whether to make vaccines compulsory, questions about when to lock down with all the economic costs of lockdowns and when not to. These are all important ethical questions.
So how about vaccinations? Do you think it should be compulsory?
Well, my view is that if somebody wants to isolate themselves from other people, let's say they want to live in a country property and grow their own food, or maybe order their supermarket deliveries to be left at their gate, so they're not in contact with anyone else, we shouldn't force them to be vaccinated because they're not posing a risk to anyone else. But for the vast majority of people who want to go out, mingle with the crowds in the cities, get on public transport, go to restaurants or bars, go to the cinema or the theaters, then yes, I think it's reasonable to require them to be vaccinated, because if they're not vaccinated, they are imposing an increased risk on the people they're mixing with. And since there's really no significant burden on them in requiring them to be vaccinated, the vaccines have very minor effects on people who get vaccinated in general over the day or two after vaccination, and the risk of serious complications, they have occurred with some vaccines, but they've been vastly smaller risks than the risks that the virus itself poses. So I think it's reasonable to require people who want to mix with other people to be vaccinated.
And how about justice in vaccines in the world? So do you think that we have obligations to share our stock of vaccines that are now in Europe, in America. I don't know how about Australia right now, but surely, I mean, we are thinking of giving the third dose in Europe or in America, while in Africa or Asia, there are still people who cannot be vaccinated and that are at the highest risk of dying or getting into hospital.
Yes, exactly. I think the vaccine distribution really mirrors the problem that I originally mentioned in terms of global poverty, the fact that there are people in extreme poverty who we could help relatively easily at no great sacrifice to us, but we don't do it. And the same is true with vaccines. When countries have sufficient supply that they're considering a third dose, although there isn't really very clear evidence that a third dose significantly increases immunity, then I think those additional vaccines should go to people who haven't even had a first dose. That seems to me pretty obvious that they will benefit more from getting a first dose, and the second dose then for those vaccines that require a second dose, than people in affluent countries will benefit from getting a third dose. So unfortunately, the fact that this isn't happening, that there are, as you say, many of the poorer countries in the world where the percentage of people who've been vaccinated is tiny, and that's because they haven't been able to get the vaccine. That's just showing the unequal and unjust distribution of resources in the world generally.
Yeah, and it seems to me that we could do it even for more egoistic reasons, because if we want the pandemic to be over, we also need to work on that in other places, just not just Europe or America, right? I mean, India or Africa is a good example. If we don't want other variants to come and affect, of course, the whole world.
Exactly. I think that's, yes, we've seen with the Delta variant that that's exactly what can happen if you have countries with the population is largely unvaccinated. New variants can develop that then come back and are very dangerous for us. So you're quite right. It's in our interest too.
So we have a few more minutes. Can you think of any other problems in bioethics that you think we should care about or should concentrate our philosophical deliberations?
Well, I have for a long time been concerned about the unnecessary suffering of people who are terminally or incurably ill and do not want to live to the very end of their lives. So I have been a supporter of medical assistance in dying. That is, that physicians should be able to prescribe something to patients that they can take so that they die humanely, peacefully at a time of their choosing, or voluntary euthanasia, where, as in the Netherlands and Belgium, doctors can give patients a lethal injection on their request, with various conditions, of course, to ensure that this is a genuine request, that it's not just a whim, that they've considered this for some time and are of sound mind. And I've been pleased to see that this has been spreading around the world, so that more and more countries and jurisdictions now permit this. In my own native country of Australia, just in the last couple of years, the states of Victoria and South Australia and Western Australia have accepted this, and I think Queensland is about to, so it will be the majority of Australians will have this right. Canadians all have this right now. I've already mentioned the Netherlands and Belgium, but Spain is legalizing this too, and Portugal seems likely to do so. Colombia in South America has. So yes, I think that this is an important bioethical issue that fortunately is moving in the right direction.
And this leads me to a rather delicate thing. So there were protests again against your taking part in those freedom games. And the protests this time came not from the right wing, but rather from the left wing, and those who support the rights of disabled people, disabled children. I could read a few of their statements, and you will know them. I mean, they are repetitive. But just to make things clear, I really wanted to ask you about clarification of your stand on that. So some people would say that you're for killing disabled children. Could you comment on that?
I'm not for killing disabled children. That's a misunderstanding of my view. I am for allowing parents of severely disabled newborn infants to have the option of deciding in the best interests of their child and of their family as a whole, that it may be better that a child, an infant, should not live. I think that this is, parents already mostly have an option of discussing with doctors the withdrawal of a respirator from a severely disabled newborn infant, maybe a very premature infant who was put on a respirator because the infant couldn't breathe. And then when doctors do scans of the brain, they discover that there's been a major hemorrhage and the child will never have the capacity to even recognize its mother, perhaps, or smile at other humans. So doctors will then give parents usually the option to withdraw the respirator, even though they know that that will end the life of the child. And that happens in intensive care units for newborn babies all over the world, I think. So I don't see a significant moral difference between ending a life by withdrawing a respirator and ending a life by giving a child a lethal injection. In both cases, the baby's going to die. Arguably, the child dies more humanely from the injection than from the withdrawal of the respirator. So that's really what I'm favoring, wider parental choice. And let me add, I'm not at all, in any sense, against people with disabilities. I think the state should support people with disabilities in leading the fullest possible lives that they can, and should provide more support for parents who choose that their children should go on. The state should make that easy for them, should make it as easy as possible for those children to live the best lives that they can, to attend normal education if they're going to be capable of benefiting from normal schools and so on. So I'm certainly concerned about the rights and well-being of people with disabilities, but I do think that the decisions that do get made when newborn babies are born with severe disabilities are best placed in the hands of parents, not in the hands of doctors who may decide to treat, because that's what doctors do. They treat, they save lives, and some doctors will do that even when it's not in the best interests of the infant or of the family whose the infant belongs to.
Thank you, Peter. I must say I want it to be heard. We need to finish. I'm very sorry. There are lots of other wonderful topics that we could talk about. I will switch into Polish again. Thank you, Peter. Dziękujemy.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I do hope that it was a good introduction to what ethics and philosophy can deal with, and how philosophy can encourage us to ask and answer questions. Peter's books are available in Polish, Animal Liberation, Practical Ethics, and some others. That is why I do encourage everybody to read the books, to consider what is written there, and not to be afraid of thinking. All the best, and see you in Łódź.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Now, morning flight 12:15.
You may now kiss the bride.
Work is different now. We're commuting less, virtually meeting more. Separating work life and life can feel challenging. It's easy to forget that to thrive at work, we need to take care of ourselves. Microsoft Viva Insights offers new experiences to balance productivity and well-being. Personal insights help you stay at your best and most productive. Add structure to your remote workday by opting for a virtual commute, carving out time to have a productive start in the morning and mindfully disconnect in the evening. Protect time before your calendar fills up for focused work, coaching, and learning. Take regular mental breaks with Headspace, tapping into dedicated moments of mindfulness. Use emotional check-ins to tune into your day-to-day mindset and well-being. Strengthen team bonds with Stay Connected experiences that prompt you to praise collaborators, schedule one-on-ones, and follow up on pending commitments and outstanding tasks. Insights for managers and leaders offer windows into how work happens and the impact on employee well-being. Identify where teams may be isolated and take action to break down silos. Quickly discover opportunities to prevent burnout, promote coaching and development, and boost engagement. You and your team's well-being is important, especially in times of change. Taking care of one another allows you to thrive and your organization to build resilience. Experience how new well-being insights in Viva can help.
Liberté Talks – to, co ważne. Seria Liberté Talks realizowana jest dzięki wsparciu Google oraz Państwa darowiznom. Na podcast Eko Podcast zaprasza Weronika Michalak.